In this lecture, we will discuss the factors that can increase the capillary filtration. In our last lecture, we discussed about the intracellular edema and extracellular edema. We discussed that excessive leakage from the capillaries or excessive filtration from the capillaries is one of the most important cause of extracellular edema. In this lecture, we will talk about all those factors or the factors which are responsible for bringing changes in the forces which increase filtration. So basically, we have to revise something which we have previously discussed in detail, but now we will summarize it quickly. Basically, at the capillary level, there are four important forces which are counteracting each other. This is, suppose, for example, a capillary. This is a capillary, and the blood that is coming from the heart through aorta, arteries, arterioles, it is basically finally coming into the capillaries and inside the blood vessels. And outside this capillary, for example, there is interstitium and different cells. Suppose, for example, these are different cells, and the spaces between these cells is the interstitium. So there are four basic factors. There are four basic forces that are playing their role in playing their role in pushing the plasma out of the capillary and then pulling the fluid inside the capillary. So the most important forces are the capillary hydrostatic pressure, that is represented with PC, capillary hydrostatic pressure. Now this pressure is basically pushing the fluid out of the capillary. This pressure is basically pushing the fluid out of the capillary into the interstitium towards the cell. Now another force is inside the capillary is the plasma colloid osmotic pressure. This force basically comes from the proteins inside the plasma. Now the proteins are exerting the colloid osmotic pressure, and they are basically trying to pull the fluid towards the capillary. The hydrostatic pressure basically comes from the fluids and the movement of the different ions other than proteins. They are basically pushing the fluids outside the capillary into the interstitium and towards the cells. The plasma colloid osmotic pressure is basically trying to pull the fluid towards the capillary. Two more forces that are basically present in the interstitium. They include the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure, that is represented by PIF, pressure in the interstitium. So interstitial fluid pressure, PIF, this pressure is basically helping the fluid to go back into the capillary. Now we discussed again and again previously that basically blood is coming, and at the end point in the capillary, some ions, some electrolytes are going towards these cells. These cells, they basically utilize the oxygen, sodium, other nutrients, and they basically put their waste into the capillary, and these capillaries will take that waste towards the heart and towards the kidney and basically towards the venous side. So from the arterial side, the blood is coming, and some of the ions, the oxygen, nutrients are being pushed towards the interstitium and towards the cells, and some of the substances are being absorbed. Now the forces responsible for this process, they are basically these four forces. So capillary hydrostatic pressure is pushing the substances outside. The proteins are basically pulling the fluid towards the capillary. The interstitial fluid pressure is also trying to push the fluid towards the capillary lumen or towards the plasma. And the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, or the proteins that are present in the interstitium, they are also trying to pull the fluid towards the interstitium. Now, there are two main things which will basically increase the chances of edema. Now, one of the most important thing is capillary coefficient. Capillary coefficient. Now, this capillary coefficient, it depends upon the surface area. It depends upon the surface area and the permeability of the capillaries. Now, for the fluid and the ions to come out of this capillary and to go inside the capillary, there must be some permeability. Now, this permeability is different for different vessels, and this permeability may vary from time to time, and this permeability of the vessel wall may change with different substances, different toxins, different drugs, etc. Now, this is one factor, the permeability, and the second thing is the area. If there is a big area for filtration, then there are a lot of chances of fluid coming out and going in. If the area is small, then the chances for the fluid to come out of the capillary and go again inside into the capillary are less. So basically, the capillary filtration coefficient, is the product of surface area and the permeability of the capillary wall or the blood vessel wall. Now, if any change occurs in the capillary coefficient, if capillary filtration coefficient, if the permeability increases or the surface area increases and the value of this capillary filtration coefficient increases, it will increase the capillary filtration. So this is one factor which will basically increase the capillary filtration, and a lot of fluid will come out, and it will basically accumulate in the interstitium, and it will lead to edema. Another important thing is that any change in the plasma which increases the capillary hydrostatic pressure, for example, heart failure. For example, heart failure, if there is a lot of fluid collecting in the vessels and this capillary hydrostatic pressure increases, then again, even if there is no change in the permeability, even if the surface area is less, but the pressure inside the capillary or pressure inside the plasma or pressure inside this blood vessel is increased, that it will also lead to a lot of fluid coming out and the fluid accumulating in the interstitium, and it will also lead to edema. And this is another reason. So increasing the capillary hydrostatic pressure, increasing the permeability, increasing the surface area of the vessel, they all basically increases the chances of edema, they all increases the chances of fluid accumulating in the interstitium. Now another important factor is the decrease in plasma colloid osmotic pressure. Decrease in plasma colloid osmotic pressure. Now this pressure basically, it is basically pulling the fluid towards the capillary, towards the plasma, towards the lumen of the blood vessels. So if there is decrease in this pressure, it will also increase the chances of fluid being accumulated in the interstitium and the chances of edema occurring. So we see that basically filtration is the product of capillary filtration coefficient into capillary hydrostatic pressure minus interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure minus plasma colloid osmotic pressure plus interstitial fluid osmotic pressure. So basically, this equation simply means that we will minus the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure from the capillary hydrostatic pressure. Then we will sum up the plasma colloid osmotic pressure and the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure. Plasma colloid osmotic pressure and the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, and then we will minus this from the this number, whatever may be the number. So this is the whole equation. This is the whole equation which basically defines, or which basically helps in calculating the filtration. So if there is an increase in the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure then it will not increase the chances of edema, because it will push the fluid towards the capillary.